There's still a whole lot of this story that hasn't been told yet. It all started when she stood right there in front of her friends, smiled, and blurted out that I was always begging to be close to her. But she didn't look me in the eye when she said it. Nope, she kept her eyes glued to them. A couple of people laughed, treating it like she just nailed a killer punchline, and I even heard someone mutter the words back to themselves. The guy standing right next to her was the first one to chuckle, throwing his head back faster than anyone else and leaning in close, like this was an inside joke they'd shared before. For a second, I just stood there frozen. Then I just nodded, took a step back, and let the crowd close up around them, leaving me on the outside. I didn't make a scene. I didn't offer a single explanation either. I just grabbed my jacket, walked right past the bar, and headed down the stairs while the music kept blasting on the floor above. For a while, I just drove around with nowhere specific to go, until I finally pulled over near the river and sat in the truck a lot longer than I thought I would. I didn't call her. I didn't send a text. I didn't even bother looking at the clock. Right after midnight, my phone started buzzing in the console. It was her name lighting up the screen, asking, "Where are you?" I just let it sit there. A few minutes later, another text popped up, "Are you coming home or not?" I watched the screen go black again, and right then, a realization hit me that I hadn't expected. I wasn't mad. Honestly, I wasn't even hurt the way most guys would be. I just didn't feel any pull to go back to her. So I didn't go home that night, and the next morning, when I woke up in a different bed, I didn't feel like I was missing a thing or leaving anything behind. That was the exact moment the distance between us stopped being an accident and became a choice. I headed into work that morning acting like it was just another regular day. Mondays were always brutal down at the freight terminal. We had semi-trucks lining up before the sun even came up, dispatch breathing down my neck about delays, and drivers swapping out their routes at the very last second. My whole job was basically keeping the wheels from falling off the wagon. I handled the processes, the scheduling, and the backup plans. It was all about stability. I'd built a real reputation around there for being the guy everyone could count on when things got chaotic. That morning, I threw myself into the work even harder than usual. I stayed out on the loading dock, walked the lanes, and caught a routing error before it could turn into a total disaster. The guys gave me a nod as I walked past. Things ran smooth because I was on top of it. That part of my life at least still made complete sense. Around lunchtime, my phone started buzzing again, showing a couple of missed calls. Then a text came through asking if we could chat later on. There was no "I'm sorry," no mention of what happened the night before. It was totally businesslike, like we were scheduling a couple of corporate calendars instead of dealing with a marriage. It made me think about how much things had changed over the last year. There were all those dinners she had to cancel because of her clients, and all those sudden trips that popped up out of nowhere. Lately, her phone was always face down on the table, silently lighting up while we were trying to watch a movie. Whenever I'd ask a simple question about it, she'd just smile, tell me work was crazy intense, and give me a quick kiss on the cheek like that solved everything. I used to tell myself it was just a temporary phase. I thought once her next big campaign wrapped up, or the next event was over, we'd find our way back to each other. I really believed closeness was something you could just put on pause and hit play on whenever you wanted. But sitting there at my desk with a spreadsheet open in front of me, I finally saw how one-sided that whole hope really was. I was the one doing all the adjusting. I was the one waiting around and making compromises. Meanwhile, she had already figured out how to live her life without even noticing I wasn't around anymore. What would you do if you found yourself in a situation like this? For the first time in a long time, I didn't feel this desperate urge to rush in and fix things. Instead, I was just curious to see what would happen if I did absolutely nothing. For the next few days, I kept my routine completely predictable. I went to work, hit the gym, grabbed a late bite to eat near the warehouse district, and checked into a hotel instead of heading back to the house. I didn't tell a soul what I was doing, and I didn't make any grand announcements to her, either. I kept my schedule open and kept my voice completely neutral whenever she called. I gave her short answers and didn't ask any questions back. She rushed to fill the silence pretty quickly. She sent messages about schedules, a charity gala she needed me to attend with her next week, and how people were asking where I disappeared to the other night. Every single text felt like a summons back to a role I was expected to play, and every single time, I let the message sit a little longer before I bothered to reply. I did stop by the house once, but only when I knew for a fact she'd be out. I grabbed my laptop, a few shirts, and the watch my dad had handed down to me. I logged into our joint bank account, moved my half of the money into a separate account, and kept it all clean and boring, just like closing out a file at work. I left every other single thing exactly where it was so it wouldn't look like some big, dramatic exit at first glance. And she didn't even notice right away. She kept texting me like I was some permanent fixture in her life. She asked if I could review a vendor contract for her, or if I'd be her +1 for a launch party the next weekend. Her tone was completely casual and confident, taking it for granted that I'd just be there. Meanwhile, I completely stopped showing up where she expected me to be. I didn't ask about her business trips anymore. I didn't say a word when she dropped the same names over and over again, or talked about the same venues and the late nights she claimed were just part of her career's momentum. From the outside looking in, nothing had officially fallen apart yet. We were still husband and wife, still listed as a couple, and still going about our separate days. That illusion of control made it easy for her to keep doing her thing, and it made it even easier for me to keep stepping away without putting up a fight. The first real crack in the armor showed up over something tiny. She asked where I'd been staying, not straight out, just a sideways question, wondering if I was still crashed at that place near the terminal. I waited longer than usual to reply, and I kept my answer pretty vague. The very next day she asked again, this time trying to sound worried. By the end of the week, her tone shifted completely to logistics, like she was trying to calculate how much access she still had to me. She started calling me at night instead of just texting. It wasn't all the time, but it was consistent, always around the exact same hour. I just let the phone ring. In the mornings, I'd wake up to a short, neutral message asking me to confirm plans we'd made weeks ago. I didn't cancel on her, but I didn't confirm anything either. Then, down at work, someone mentioned seeing her name on the guest list for an upcoming industry gala. It was a huge venue, high profile, exactly the kind of night she loved to turn into a personal statement. I knew the event well. I'd stood right by her side there before, shaking hands, smiling on command, and playing the part of the supportive husband to make us look like the perfect couple. Later that week, she sent over the invitation link without a single word of explanation. My name was still on the ticket. She followed it up later with a one-line text asking if I was going to make it. I just went into the RSVP link, removed my name, and closed out the browser tab. No message back. No explanation given. The next call came a lot quicker this time around. She left a voicemail, her voice sounding steady but incredibly tight, asking what the hell was going on and saying we needed to talk. I listened to it exactly once and archived it. From that moment on, she stopped assuming everything was fine and started checking up on me. She checked my schedule, my weekends, and my events. The gaps I was leaving behind weren't invisible to her anymore. Something she'd always taken for granted was slipping through her fingers, and she could feel it happening without having a clue how to stop it. Finally, she pushed for a face-to-face meeting. It wasn't a screaming match or a big confrontation. It was just a controlled request masked as practical business. She suggested we grab lunch near her office at one of those quiet spots she used for soft negotiations, where people talk in hushed tones and major decisions are slid across the table without making a sound. I agreed to it and showed up right on time. She looked completely put together, the exact way she always did before a big event. Her hair was perfect, her phone was face down on the table, and her attention was completely split even though we were sitting right across from each other. She took the lead, filling up the silence with updates about her job, our mutual friends, and future plans that assumed we were still going strong. She brought up the gala again, explicitly stating it would look really weird if I wasn't standing there with her. Not that it was wrong, mind you, just strange. When she finally asked what I was doing, she framed it like a little logistical problem, something we just needed to fix so everything could go right back to normal. I looked at her and told her I was stepping back from all our shared commitments for the time being. I didn't give her a timeline, and I didn't offer an explanation. I just said it calmly and let the weight of the words hang in the air. And right there is when she made her biggest mistake. She smiled, that exact same condescending smile she gives to clients who hesitate on a deal, and told me I was totally overreacting. She sneered that closeness had never exactly been my strong suit anyway, and that I always had a habit of taking things too personally. Then she reminded me how incredibly busy her world was right now and how many people depended on her energy, before adding, almost like an afterthought, that I was more than welcome to come to the gala if I could actually handle the pace. She didn't apologize to me. She didn't ask what I needed from her. Instead, she twisted my absence into some kind of personal flaw that I needed to figure out how to manage. So, I paid the bill for lunch, stood up from the table, and wished her the best of luck with her event. I didn't argue with her, I didn't try to correct her version of the story, and I didn't promise to think it over. When I walked out of that restaurant, I cleared the rest of my afternoon and forwarded all my work calls. I went straight back to the apartment I'd been renting and finished up the final steps I'd been putting off. I updated all my emergency contacts, unlinked the rest of our shared subscriptions, and changed the passwords on absolutely everything tied to my name. From that point forward, there wasn't a single shred of confusion left to clear up. She had chosen her angle, and I had already completely removed myself from the picture. After that lunch, I simply stopped being reachable in any of the ways she was used to. I kept my phone turned on, but I wasn't picking up late-night calls anymore. I stopped rearranging my weekends for her, and I sure as heck wasn't stepping in whenever she needed a man around to smooth things over or play the part. If a document needed my signature, it just sat there and signed. If she needed a +1 for an event, that space beside her stayed completely empty. She reacted by turning up the pressure, though she never actually raised her voice. The calls started coming in faster, and the gaps between her messages got shorter. She'd ask me questions that were poorly disguised as casual updates. She kept mentioning how people were starting to ask questions about where I was, how noticeable it was becoming, and how awkward it made things for her. I'd read her messages whenever I had a spare second, and then I'd just leave them on read. The first event she went to without me wasn't one of her big headline nights. It was just a small, private dinner with a limited guest list. She texted me a photo from the table, with everyone's faces cropped out carefully. It was a familiar room I'd stood in plenty of times myself, but she didn't send any text with it. I didn't reply. That weekend, she showed up at the house while I was out, and she called me the second she realized my closet looked a lot emptier than she remembered. Her voice stayed perfectly even, but she wanted to know where my clothes were and when I planned on dropping by. I told her I'd grab the rest of my junk later, and then I hung up the phone. By that point, the pattern was plain as day to both of us. I wasn't just drifting away or throwing a temper tantrum. I was completely gone from the structure that kept her life running smoothly. She still had her big events, her social circle, and all her career momentum. But what she didn't have anymore was that quiet assurance that I'd just show up whenever it mattered to her image. And the closer that big gala got, the louder my absence seemed to echo. By the time gala week finally rolled around, she stopped pretending this whole thing was just a temporary phase. Her messages started changing shape, less about scheduling and a whole lot more about putting the screws to me. She straight up asked if I was trying to humiliate her. She asked if I even understood how bad this looked to her peers, and if I seriously planned on just vanishing without giving her an explanation. I didn't give her a single word back. What she couldn't see from her side was just how peaceful and clean my days had become. I didn't have to worry about last-minute changes or standing around near the exit doors waiting for her to finish networking. I didn't have my weekends blocked out for public appearances that had absolutely nothing to do with me. I slept when I wanted to, worked late when the job demanded it, and kept my entire life small and completely under my own control. The guys down at the terminal noticed I was a lot steadier, too, mostly because I wasn't distracted by a phone lighting up every 10 minutes. She, on the other hand, was starting to hit a wall of questions she couldn't easily dodge. Friends who took it for granted that I'd be by her side were demanding to know where I was, and her colleagues were making jokes about her husband finally getting burnt out on the social circuit. She tried to laugh it off at first, but her story just stopped adding up. Eventually, a mutual acquaintance mentioned to me, totally in passing, that they'd seen her show up somewhere with a familiar face from her work events. A guy who seemed to be hovering around her a lot lately. The comment was casual, almost like an afterthought, and I didn't bother asking for details because I honestly didn't need them. She called me that exact night and left a much longer voicemail than usual. She wasn't angry. She kept herself completely controlled. She told me we needed to talk before people started getting the wrong idea, saying that my silence was creating a narrative she couldn't manage. I listened to it once, hit delete, and moved on. The real cost of my absence wasn't anything dramatic. There weren't any screaming matches or big confrontations. It just showed up quietly, right in the exact spots where I used to stand without anyone noticing me. And the thing is, once people start noticing an empty space, they don't stop looking at it. The night of the gala arrived, and my phone stayed completely silent. There was no reminder text, no last-minute check-in, nothing. I knew she'd finally given up hope that I might just show up unannounced. The seat right next to her was either going to stay empty or somebody else was going to fill it. There wasn't a third option on the table anymore. I wasn't there, and honestly, I didn't need to be. The next morning, the gossip reached me in little pieces. A guy from my industry brought up the event while we were grabbing coffee, mentioning it was a great turnout, real polished and well done. Then he paused, looked at me, and casually asked if everything was all right at home. He told me he'd fully expected to see me there, and that everyone else did, too. Later that afternoon, I got another call from someone who knew her a bit better. He didn't sound like he was fishing for gossip. It felt more like he was just confirming what he already suspected. He told me she arrived completely alone and stayed that way for a good chunk of the night. People definitely noticed, and the questions started early. She kept her smile plastered on and kept redirecting the conversation, working the room just like she always did. But that space beside her stayed completely open all through the first round of speeches. Then, about halfway through the evening, she popped up again, but this time she had him with her. It wasn't a grand announcement or a massive statement. It was just a quiet shift. He was a guy from her professional circle, confident, familiar, and already looking entirely too comfortable in that role. They moved through the crowd together like they'd practiced it beforehand, not standing close enough to invite open gossip, but not far enough apart for anyone to deny what was actually going on. By then, my absence had already done its job, and seeing someone replace me didn't shock a single soul. If anything, it just cleared up the confusion. Nobody called me that night, mostly because they didn't need to anymore. She finally reached out 2 days later, but not with a phone call. She sent an email right in the middle of the afternoon with a completely blank subject line. She wrote it like a lawyer documenting a misunderstanding before it could turn into a real legal problem. She claimed things had been taken totally out of context and that the gala had forced her into a really awkward position. She said people were talking trash and that the whole situation was completely unfair to her. She never mentioned the guy by name, and she didn't ask where I was staying. She just suggested we meet up to clear the air, saying it would be a lot easier if we presented a united front before everyone's assumptions hardened into fact. The wording was incredibly careful. It was pure damage control, not an attempt to fix a marriage, so I didn't send a reply. That evening, I dropped by the house one last time, making sure to go early enough to miss her schedule completely. I packed up the remaining things I actually cared about and left the rest untouched. I didn't leave a note, and I didn't leave any signals. I just pulled the door shut behind me the exact same way I always had. The next morning, a coworker forwarded me a link without saying a word. It was a photo from a recap of the event, one of those wide-angle shots meant to capture the atmosphere of the room. She was right there in the middle of it, caught mid-conversation, with her hand resting lightly on his arm. It wasn't a posed shot, and it wasn't dramatic. It just looked entirely too comfortable. That single image traveled a whole lot faster than any explanation ever could. It found its way into inboxes, group chats, and people's casual social media scrolls. By the time the sun went down, the version of us she'd been trying so hard to protect simply didn't exist anywhere that mattered anymore. She called me late that night, way past her usual hour, but I just let it ring. The real twist in all of this wasn't that she had someone else lined up. It was the fact that she stepped right out into the open the exact moment the space beside her stayed empty. And by that point, there was absolutely nothing left for me to step back into anyway. We never had that final, big conversation. There was no long, drawn-out talk at the kitchen table, and no formal ending marked by yelling or explanations. On paper, the marriage just stayed open, like an old file on a computer that nobody bothers to close because the entire system has already moved on to something else. She stopped calling me after that week. It didn't happen overnight, but it was a steady fade until the messages slowed down and finally vanished altogether. Whenever we did have to communicate, it was strictly about logistics over email, completely stripped of any emotion or expectation. It was all about dates, access, and items that needed to be picked up, nothing that assumed we had any kind of future together. I ended up settling into a completely different rhythm. I kept the same job and the same responsibilities, just with a lot fewer interruptions. People stopped asking me about her entirely once they saw her consistently showing up places with that other guy. The questions just answered themselves. Once, months down the road, I caught a glimpse of her across a packed room at an industry event I had to attend for work. I wasn't planning on staying long anyway, just long enough to show my face and take off. She noticed me standing there, hesitated for a split second, and then turned right back to the man beside her. He leaned in, whispered something that made her smile, and guided her toward a different group of people. She never looked back at me. I left the event early and drove straight home without taking any detours or stopping along the way. The place I was living in by then was quiet and intentional. Every single thing inside those walls belonged to me, and absolutely nothing was waiting on someone else's hectic schedule. What ultimately ended our marriage wasn't a confession or some massive confrontation. It was just a series of choices that became crystal clear the second I stopped filling up the empty space. The door stayed wide open because it didn't even need to be closed. I had already stepped so far away from it that it didn't lead anywhere I ever needed to go again. Thanks for sticking around and listening to the story all the way to the end. Go ahead and write a comment with your thoughts on how all of this went down, and don't forget to subscribe. There are plenty of other untold stories on the way.